Hi there, I'm Gideon Rose, editor of Foreign Affairs, and welcome to another edition of Foreign Affairs Focus. We have the great pleasure today of speaking with Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who's just back from a diplomatic mission to Northern Ireland, where he was helping the local parties negotiate their differences. So, Richard, why were you there, under what auspices, and what were you doing?
Well, it's 15 years since the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, negotiated with the help of George Mitchell above all, but obviously with the American, British, and Irish governments. But about a year ago, things began to fray at the edges. There were big protests, some more violence, and the political leaders of Northern Ireland essentially reached a consensus that they needed a new diplomatic process. A lot of the so-called constructive ambiguity that made it possible to reach the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement had suddenly or increasingly become a liability. And day-to-day life was beginning to deteriorate. So there's 5 parties there who form the so-called executive within the parliament, and there's a first minister and a deputy first minister. And what they did was they met last spring, and they decided to launch a new political process. They came to the conclusion that it would be better if it were led by an independent outsider, someone who didn't have his roots, shall we say, in Northern Ireland or in London or in Dublin. And they came to me. They knew me from the time I was the U.S. envoy for 3 years at the beginning of George W. Bush's presidency. And they asked me in to essentially facilitate a negotiation amongst the 5 principal political parties of Northern Ireland.
So what were some of these issues that were fudged earlier on in order to make an agreement possible, but that came back to bite you later on in the day?
The principal issue that really hadn't been dealt with, interestingly enough, 15 years ago, was the past. You think about it, Rwanda, South Africa, a lot of countries that have gone through traumatic histories. A lot of these societies have had mechanisms, so-called truth and justice mechanisms, what have you, for dealing with the legacy of the past. Northern Ireland essentially never had its legacy. And nearly 3,700 people died during the 3 decades of the so-called Troubles. And the question was, how do you deal with this legacy, both at an individual level, so-called survivors and victims, but also at the societal level? How do you essentially contend with bitterness, with the issues, with justice issues, with personal issues, dealing with the past, in a way that actually promotes reconciliation across the society? So that was the biggest, essentially undeveloped issue. In addition, there were 2 specific issues, both of which will sound somewhat odd, in particular to American ears. One is the issue of parading. There's a tradition in Northern Ireland of so-called parading or marches, largely a Protestant tradition, the so-called Unionists. And this is essentially just that, as these are public marches, demonstrations, rallies, more than 4,000 a year now, in which people go, and there's often music and just at times good merriment, at times something other than merriment. A lot of these are uncontentious, but probably 5% or so, several hundred a year, are quite contentious, often because of the routes they take through certain neighborhoods. They're not welcome in many cases in the, if it's a largely Catholic neighborhood, it's obviously not welcome. It also goes the other way. There are sometimes commemorations by groups, say, like Sinn Féin, historically affiliated with the IRA, that commemorates this or that individual who is associated with what would widely be seen as terrorism, the use of violence for political ends. And the question is, should they be allowed to do that? So there's that whole set of issues. How do you regulate what is, quote unquote, the right of free expression and the right of assembly, but how in a democratic society where you've got this past, how do you regulate these in ways that don't destroy relationships, yet are respectful of rights? That's one set of issues. The other, equally difficult and symbolic, is the question of flags and emblems. Where can, for example, the Union flag fly? How many days, over what buildings? What other flags and emblems should be allowed, whether it's flying from lampposts or painting curbstones? Again, it may sound bizarre to an American audience, but these are issues of identity. These are powerful political, psychological, social issues that are fundamental, particularly in a divided society. So the remit I was given was to deal with these 3 sets of issues: the past, parades, and flags and emblems.
Now, as you've said, these are things that come up in lots of cases where you've had torn societies trying to knit themselves back together. So was the Irish case just the latest in a long string of these where you could draw on experience in other cases to do it, or were there unique aspects to the Irish case that made it more problematic or different from others?
The short answer and not helpful answer is both. I was the U.S. envoy for the Cyprus talks for several years early in my career. I've been heavily involved in Israeli negotiations with Palestinians and Arab governments. I was sent many times to negotiate between India and Pakistan.
Did you ever work on anything that actually worked?
I was going to say my career has been unblemished by success. So there's lots of similarities. One of the most difficult issues is that if you deconstruct it and it's questions of identity and association, very hard to compromise. We're not talking about where to draw a border, if it's, say, between states. It's the reason that it was far less difficult as it was, say, to negotiate Israeli-Syrian or Israeli-Egyptian disengagement agreements and so forth, than it has been to deal with Israeli-Palestinian issues. It's the reason that the Greek-Turkish issue on Cyprus has never been successfully dealt with. It's not simply a question of territory, particularly where people are commingled, and where, in this case, you're part of the same political entity, though with very different dreams of the future. You, by definition, have a large segment of the population, a plurality, that is quote-unquote unionist, largely Protestant, that wants to stay part of the Union, as you know, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So they want the political arrangement to stay where it is. And there's other people, largely nationalists and Republicans, to use their terminology, Catholic, many of whom want to become united with Ireland, with the Republic of Ireland, quote-unquote, the South. And under the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, there's a mechanism by which if polls are taken in both countries that indicate a majority of people in each want the union of Northern Ireland with Ireland to happen, it happens, but otherwise the political arrangement stays the way it is. So while that's fixed, people have very different dreams. And again, you have all the problems of a divided society. Just to give you more than you want to know, before the Troubles began, there was a civil rights movement there, in some ways patterned on the American civil rights movement, because to a large extent, at that point, the majority or dominant Protestant community often did not create enough equal space, if you might call it, for the minority Catholic community. And there was a civil rights movement, and very quickly, depending upon whose narrative you listen to, it descended into violence and terrorism on all sides. So you have that legacy, but now, even without that, while that, thankfully, is mostly a thing of the past, the question is still, how do you work out these symbolic issues you and I talked about in, by the way, what is one of the most segregated societies in the world? More than 90% of the children still go to single denominational schools.
So is there busing in Northern Ireland?
No, but I've often thought back to that. I've thought back to the experience here, say, in Boston and in other cities, and that's not happening there. You have a very small, what's called integrated education movement, where you have these schools explicitly built to bring together kids from two traditions. And you have now the growth of what's called shared schools, where you have, say, a largely Catholic school, what we would call a parochial school, a school where the kids happen to be Protestant, simply because that reflects the neighborhood, but they might come together for certain academic or sporting functions where they're geographically proximate.
And so what progress were you able to make with them? How did you get the people to come together? Obviously, if they wanted you there, they were ready, the time was ripe for some kind of progress, or else they wouldn't have invited you in.
Presumably.
Presumably, but so what were you able to do?
Considerable progress, indeed surprising progress on dealing with the past. When I took the position, everyone said that's going to be the most difficult of the issues. The least work has been done. It's the most complicated. Surprisingly enough, that's where we made the most progress. And we produced this document. We went through 7 drafts of it, the last draft on 31 December. And the lion's share of it, or the biggest piece of it, is devoted to the past. And I actually believe there we seriously advanced the discussion, the elite as well as public discussion of what could and should be done to successfully contend with this set of issues, both at the individual level and at the societal level. On parading or marching or public assemblies and protests, we made less progress, but we still made progress in coming up with a new regulatory mechanism that would be devolved. Most issues have now been devolved to Northern Ireland away from Westminster. We came up with a proposal for devolving it, for administratively dealing with the 95% or so of the marches that are non-contested, a separate mechanism for dealing with those that are contested, adjudication mechanism. So I think that was quite good. Where we ran a cropper a little bit were on issues of what would be the code of conduct that would actually govern these marches. And where we were least successful was in the area of flags and emblems. Essentially, there could not be agreement among the 5 parties about the role of the Union flag or emblems, flags in official or unofficial places, other flags, what have you. And there the decision, the most you could get was an agreement essentially to set up another political process that would continue to try to foster some kind of agreement in that area. It was just simply, a friend of mine used to have 3 boxes on his desk, in, out, too hard, and the flag issue went firmly into the too hard box.
Well, let me just ask one final question. A lot of times people think that these things are either going to be solved by the parties or not solved because the parties don't want them to be solved. But the whole point of your being there was the idea that mediation and negotiation can actually make the difference between, it's not just whether the parties want it or not, you still need help to get them there. So what was it that you were able to do that might have helped produce some kind of progress that they weren't able to do for themselves?
Mediation can often, as you suggest, provide the, I don't know if it's the last 5% or 10%. And in some ways you can put forward ideas, you can hear people, you don't come at it with the baggage or agenda. And I often used to do my version of James Baker and say, I don't have a dog in this hunt. And I was just trying to hear them out and promote ideas that I actually thought would make a difficult situation less difficult. In that sense, you can really be, and I tried to be, an honest broker. But as you're, what I said before, coming back to it, but 90 to 95% doesn't come from the mediator. I don't care how talented you are. It comes from, to use a word that you and I both use a lot, is ripeness. And it's the willingness and ability of the protagonist to come to agreement, to compromise. And what you realize in these things is that you can often do pretty well around the table in brokering or compromises and even a degree of consensus. It's much harder, though, away from the table, in the light, if you will, of public opinion. And it's often bedeviled the Middle East talks, where people, and it's happened here, where it's very difficult given the bases of parties and given the need to not simply agree across the table, but essentially agree over your shoulders. And it's often extraordinarily difficult in democracies. We see it in our own country. Look at the difficulty of coming up with agreements in Capitol Hill dealing with tax and spending and entitlement reforms. And there's some similar things in Northern Ireland, where it's very difficult, no matter who the mediator is, no matter what the quality of the ideas or compromises. And even if you're better off, the tendency is always for people to focus in on those parts of the agreement they don't like, either because what's there or what's not there. And in the end, in the short run, that proved to be too much here, and it was narrowly defeated in a vote in Parliament recently. That said, my hunch is you need to take a longer-term view of these things, and even if we didn't get it over the goal line, or whatever sporting metaphor you want to use, these ideas now provide a new baseline, and whether it's next week or next month or next year, sooner or later, the 5 parties are going to have to come back to these 3 issues, and the range of compromise is not going to be fundamentally different than what was in the negotiations that just took place. So even if we didn't, quote unquote, succeed now, something like this will have to take effect if Northern Ireland is really going to move forward.
So the Haass plan is like the Clinton plan?
In some ways, yes. That in all of these agreements, in all these negotiations rather, there's not too many new things under the sun. And the least important aspect of it, as important as it is often the details of the plan. It comes back to this question of building a political space where people feel incentivized to agree, or would feel disincented, if you will, to disagree. So if and when parties are ever ready in the Middle East to come back to the negotiating table, the 2-state solution along some version of the Clinton plan and parameters is the only place you can go. And I would say something like that here. If and when, and I hope it's when, and I hope it's sooner rather than later, the parties are prepared to come back to make a deal, it'll be some version of this. And to be fair, what we did was in some ways it built upon previous plans. It's very rare you can come at these negotiations that go back decades, much less centuries, and totally reinvent the wheel in ways that haven't been considered before.
And in the longer run, the Irish example really is a deeply positive one, isn't it? I mean, a generation ago, if you were to look at various difficult conflicts around the globe, you would not have picked the Irish one as one that would be moving forward so quickly and thoroughly towards a positive outcome.
You know, what I learned from this and what it shows is what was done 15 years ago was a very good example of diplomacy, and that largely, not entirely, but largely ended the conflict. And then it led to the devolution of political powers. People gave up most of their arms and so forth. But there's a difference between doing things that essentially end conflicts and doing things that make and build peace. And that's where we are now in Northern Ireland. And it's making the transition from the former to the latter that's proven difficult. But I think it will happen. I really do think it's a question of when and not if, but we're not and they are not quite there yet.
Richard Haass, thank you very much.
Thank you.